Good morning. Welcome to the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Hopefully, y'all have all had a good holiday and everything, and I know I did, and it's good to be home. I am not your regular Bible class teacher, as many of you know. That would normally be the full-time preacher here, Jeff O'Rear. Now I'm just filling in this Sunday. Before we get started, I've asked Brother Danny Williams to lead us in prayer.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and all of the blessings. Father, we pray for this church. We pray for this worship this morning. We pray that it's done in a manner that will be pleasing to you. Father, we pray that you be with the teachers this morning, that they have a ready recollection of the things they prepare, and be with us as students to take it in and use it in our lives. Forgive us when we fall short. In Christ's name, amen.
Well, this morning, what I've prepared my class on is Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. I think this is a passage that most of us are pretty familiar with, and I do want to read it this morning. We'll get there in here in just a little bit, but I don't want to go through a verse-by-verse breakdown or anything this morning. There's actually a few key sections I want to center in on and ask some questions, some thought-provoking questions, I hope, and then make some comparisons to things later on in the biblical narrative. So, first thing I want to cover this morning is how do we get to Genesis 22? First things first, Genesis 1 through 11, I've kind of thrown in all together. It basically sets the entire stage for how we get to Abraham, because Genesis 12 starts with Abraham, and 1 through 11 kind of set the stage of what is the world like when we get there. Genesis 12 opens up with this call to God to, well, at the time, Abram, who eventually becomes Abraham. And it starts with these promises and stuff. You know, this covenant relationship begins. Genesis 13 and 14 deal with the separation of Abraham and Lot, eventually Abraham coming back to save Lot, and then this priestly blessing Abraham receives from Melchizedek. If you want to go down a fun rabbit hole sometimes, just start researching Melchizedek. It's crazy. Then we get Genesis 15. Contains another part of this Abrahamic covenant, and then particularly we get the specification of a child through Sarah. Then Genesis 16 contains another failure of Abraham. They kind of pop up in and out of the story. Abraham has some real high moments and some real lows. And that's a big part of what leads us into Genesis 22. Because Abraham, as I'm sure many of us know, tries to use Hagar to kind of subvert God's promise of a child and have his own child prematurely, I guess is a good way to put it. Genesis 17 contains covenant circumcision and God's reassurance of his promises to Abraham. Genesis 18 shows Abraham's generosity to visitors and compassion for Sodom. But in this moment, Abraham also directly challenges God because he's trying to, show compassion for Sodom. But in this moment, he does directly challenge God. Genesis 19, I didn't include it up here, but that is what we would call Sodom and Gomorrah. But that does not really have Abraham in it. That is more of a Lot story. But Genesis 20 shows another of Abraham's failures and is dealing with Abimelech. He manages to sell Sarah into a foreign harem twice. Once is kind of hard, twice, I don't know how you do it. And then Genesis 21 is the birth of Isaac, and then the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael from Abraham's house. So at this point, before we dive directly into the text of Genesis 22, any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas? All right, if not, can I get somebody to read the first 9 verses of Genesis 22? I'll take that then. Start with me, Genesis 22, verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said, "Abraham, here am I," he answered. "Take your son," he said, "your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship, then we'll come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. And Isaac spoke to his father, Abraham, and said, "My father." And he replied, "Here am I, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Then the 2 of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." He replied, "Here am I." Then he said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram out and offered it as a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." So today it is said, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, this is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because you have obeyed my command." Abraham went back to his young men, and they got up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham settled in Beersheba. So that's Genesis 22. I have a couple questions I want to lead into here. So Genesis 22:1 makes it clear from the beginning that this is not a outright demand from God, but rather it's a test to Abraham. Meaning that there is a right and a wrong answer for Abraham in this instance. But verse 2 also kind of makes it clear that it's a command. It's explicitly stated. Where is it? Well, yeah, never mind. Scratch what I just said. God just says, take your son up and offer him. There's no, maybe do this, maybe do that. God just commands it. Take your son up and offer him to me. It's hard to juxtapose. It's a test, but God doesn't make it seem like Abraham has a choice. So there's 2 fundamental questions to answer here. How could a good man such as Abraham even be willing to do such an act as killing his son? And how could God command Abraham to kill his son? Because God, as we all believe, is a good God, a just and right God. So how could God ask this, the killing of Isaac, this promised son, the son of, his covenant with Abraham? How can God command this? I want to deal with the first question. How can Abraham even be willing to do this act? Any ideas on that as we dive in?
If you go to Hebrews 11, he believed that he would be returned to him. So that God gives and God takes away. God gives life and takes life. But he would be returned to him because he was the son of promise.
Yep, that's a good one, Hebrews 11:19. Any other ideas? Well, this is the restating of the question, but Genesis 22:1 does make this clear there's a test. So Abraham has a choice in this situation. He could choose not to do this at all and fail this test. So there is that option on the table. But as we all know, he does go through with the sacrifice. This test is one to see if Abraham is truly reliant on God. Throughout the story so far, we've seen Abraham in several situations where he has failed to do so. Anybody remember any of those specific situations? Pharaoh and Abimelech. And Abraham seems to have this issue trusting God so far. He's close. He's been teetering this line. At times he leans into it, and then at times he kind of pulls out. And this is that moment God kind of pins him down and goes, do you trust in me? The entire point is just to see if this trust will be put forward by Abraham. And it's also a test to see if God can trust Abraham. God is trying to do something great with Abraham. And there's one thing that God can truly see: do you trust me? This child you have wanted for years, kill him. It's brutal. I think sometimes we forget how brutal this scenario is because we've read it so much, which, I mean, that's a good thing. We need to read this. But it is not a pretty situation in a lot of ways. But Genesis 22:5 and 22:8 are two verses I want to look at real quick. And Ms. Garrett already brought up Hebrews 11, where, Abraham did believe that, God could raise Isaac yet again. So 22:5. Then Abraham said, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over to worship. Then we'll come back to you." I think that's a key point here. Abraham had no doubt in his mind going up this mountain, Isaac will return with me. He did believe God would bring Isaac back in some way. Now we know that wasn't necessarily the case because Isaac never died. And then verse 8, Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." God will provide. That's what Abraham ends up naming this mountain at the end of the narrative here, is that God will provide. In this moment, Abraham feels that God is going to protect him and his son. So that's why Abraham felt like he could kill Isaac, because he knew that probably wasn't going to be the option. And even if it did happen, God could still provide for him and for Isaac. Any thoughts, ideas, comments?
We kind of blame it or condemn Abraham for lying, and then also for this taking Hagar and having a child, and then asking God if this would be the one through which the promise came. But he was really, I think, exhibiting, and it's probably why God revealed this, our very attitudes that we have. We believe God, but in our belief we think, well, God has made these promises. Because he's made these promises, I can do these things. I can tell Pharaoh that Sarah is my sister, which she was, our half-sister, and God's going to take care of it. God will take care of it, which is not totally relying on God, but I don't think he went in with, God can't protect me at all, so I've got to protect myself. It was almost in a way of tempting or testing God to say, I know Sarah's going to be okay. I can tell this, and all going to be okay. I have to kind of help God along, or I can push this idea along because this is what I've been promised. And we kind of can operate that way too. That God has given us these blessings, and therefore I can act in a certain way, or I can neglect to do something, or I can do something in a way that's maybe not legitimate, but I know I have the promises of God. I have the blessing of Christ. I have redemption. I have forgiveness of sin. And that's an attitude we need to be very careful with, that we don't think that we can act on our own to any extent because of what God has promised.
Absolutely. Especially here in this Abraham story, proper relationship with God is one of submission. And I think sometimes we can try to jump that by, oh, well, God's given me this and that, as you said, and kind of doing what we want instead of what God would want, which is failing in that submission. And I think that's a very much so a theme presented here in Genesis 22 as well. Well, now I want to get into, how could God demand this killing? How could God demand Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? There's two ways I think God's justified here that are presented within the narrative. The first is the sacrifice of Isaac is a real test. I do believe Abraham has a fundamental choice here. And it's a choice between Abraham choosing his own will and God's will. And this is the choice we've all had. This is a choice that presents itself all the way back in the start of creation. This is the very test that Adam and Eve failed. God tells them, do not eat of the tree of knowledge and good and evil, because that is what he's asked of them. And as we all know, they fail in that test. Not because they, really wanted to do it, but it's nothing outside of them choosing what they wanted to do. And Abraham is presented with that same option here. And I full well believe that, especially within Genesis, where all these choices are presented, all these characters have the choice. And Abraham is the one that gets it right. And I think that's part of the reason at the end of this narrative we get this promise of a seed. Because Abraham finally chooses God's will over his own. And I think that's a fundamental choice that Abraham has. God does give Abraham the choice here. And asking everything of Abraham here is the only way God can know Abraham's all in. Because, like we've covered, Abraham's kind of teetered this line of, well, I'll do this, sell Sarah off here, but God has my back. But he doesn't have God's back. He hasn't trusted in God. And this is God's way of testing that. Do you truly trust in me? The second is God needs to establish who's in control of this covenant relationship. God holds all the power here. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But Abraham, like we've said, is kind of played fast and loose with the rules here. And this is God's reason. Part of the reasoning here is God's trying to establish, I am in control. This is my relationship with you, and I am the one who sets the terms, the rules, and everything, and you need to submit to me. And that's, into the Genesis worldview of the book of Genesis, that is the proper relationship with God. Submission to him and his will. And that is what God's trying to establish here. And as I stated quickly earlier, in Genesis 18, Abraham does outright challenge God when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah. And then he also does try to subvert the promise with Ishmael. So God has a reasoning here to challenge Abraham's authority in the relationship and establish that he is the one who is in control. Any thoughts, ideas so far on what's been presented?
Job is just God giveth and God taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then another place, and I don't know where it is, it says, all life is mine. God created it. And he has the right to take it away, that he's done nothing wrong. And with the sin in the world the way it was, every man probably deserved to have his life taken away. Because the wages of sin is death. So God was not, by saying, asking him to offer Isaac. In our eyes, we might think, well, that's not right. No, God had every right to do it whenever he wanted to do it.
Man's the one that introduced sin into the equation, and as you just said, the wages of sin is death. This is all a consequence of man's actions if Isaac dies. And I think you're completely correct in everything you just said. God is the creator. I mean, that's covered 21 chapters before this. And as the creator, creation is all under his authority. So, and we are all created. Isaac was created. So yeah, I think that's almost a third bullet point you could tack onto my idea here. So God demanding everything here just puts Abraham in that proper role of submission to him. And this just shows that they finally entered the proper relationship. Because from this point on, God doesn't really have an issue with Abraham like this again. Abraham seems to be straight in line with God from this point on. We don't get any other narratives like, Hagar going into an Egyptian harem or Abimelech's harem or anything like that. We just get Abraham's a good man. So, before we move on, any other ideas, thoughts?
When we have mistakes or sin and we disobey God, for Abraham, through creating, he learned from that. And it creates great faith for us when, you get to his age with a child. And, all the mistakes, he used them in a faithful way. That's why he's don't create faith from it, repentance and that sort of thing. You know, it's truly a test of his faith. That's what God created.
Yeah, it is a test of faith, and it does. I mean, yes, I completely agree. It does. For the reason we do see him in Hebrews in this, however we call it, Hall of Fame of faith, or however you want to put that. It's a very good point. Any other thoughts or ideas before we move on? All right. Well, this is one of the biggest things I want to hit this morning is Genesis 22 and looking forward to Jesus. The entire Bible is centralized around Jesus, and I think this story is absolutely no exception. If anything, I think this narrative is crying for a Jesus comparison, and that's something I want to go through this morning. Let me get my notes together on this real fast. I think this story is very archetypal of Jesus in a lot of ways, and directly points to Jesus in a lot of ways, and there's several lines of comparison that you can draw just very quickly and easily. But I do want to discuss these and get y'all's opinions on them. So, Genesis 22 is a narrative that points directly to Jesus. There are several direct comparisons between, one, Jesus and Isaac, and Abraham and God. They both play similar roles in their father-son relationships throughout this entire story. So, the first is that both Jesus and Isaac are promised sons, born of promise. Matthew 3:17 is, this is my beloved son, in reference to Jesus. And as we know, Isaac is part of this covenant relationship with God, and this is his promised son, born through a miraculous circumstance, both. I mean, how old is Sarah when she has him? I can't remember off the top of my head. But, and then Jesus is born Virgin Mary. They're both sons born through miraculous circumstance. That's the first major comparison I have between the two. Both sons also carry the wood on their backs, which is to be involved in their deaths. When I first had it pointed out to me, I was kind of like, wow, that didn't jump right off the page at me, but it makes complete sense. I mean, Genesis 22:6, you have the verse literally saying, Abraham's putting the wood on Isaac's back for him to carry. And then John 19:17, Jesus carries his cross up to Golgotha. Both of them carry this means of their death to where they're supposed to die. And I thought that was, just a poignant idea. In both narratives, the father leads the son up the mountain, and the son is obedient to follow up to his death. We get Christ in Gethsemane saying, not my will, but your will be done. And Isaac never, in the Genesis 22, never fights back against it. We have no evidence that Isaac even remotely tries to stop Abraham from sacrificing him. Both sons seem to be obedient, or all the way up to death. And Christ even makes the same choice as Abraham, as we just discussed, not my will, but your will be done. It's the fundamental choice of all the Bible. Is it God's will or my will? It's a question we all have to answer. It's a question we see Abraham, Isaac, David, name a character, they've probably had to make that decision somewhere in our biblical narrative. And my final major point here is, in both situations, a substitute is offered for the sacrifice. A ram in the case for Abraham and Isaac, and Jesus is directly called the Lamb of God, a substitute for me and for every single one of us. Christ was the substitute in his own story for us. So my question is, what do these comparisons mean? This is open for comment. Well, in my view, this just puts Genesis 22 as a story pointing forward to a greater redemption of not just Abraham, but all of humanity. The entire biblical narrative, starting from Genesis 3, is calling for something greater. Because we get in Genesis 1 and 2, this ultimate cohabitation with God. Adam and Eve are in cohabitation with God from the beginning. There's no separation. Genesis 3, sin enters the equation. And man is physically separated from God in more ways than we can even think about. They are cast from the garden and to never return. But Abraham marks a change in all of this, because from Genesis 1 through 11, man continues to fail. Genesis 1 through 11 marks the rebellion of man in every instance, particularly through innocent bloodshed on the earth. And then God decides to start again with Abraham, to establish a nation of priests, to follow him, to be his image to the world. And Genesis 22 is the moment where that choice, God knows he's made the right choice, because Abraham trusted him just as much as God is putting his trust in Abraham. And that is a fundamental point that's pointing forward to what Christ has to do. Christ submits himself to God and points towards this redemption of us and of everyone, as long as we do the one fundamental choice that was presented to Adam and Eve. They failed. Presented to Abraham here in Genesis 22, in which he passes, and the one Christ makes in Gethsemane. Not my will, but your will be done. That's what I believe Genesis 22 is pointing towards. Any thoughts, ideas? I know I just spat out a lot.
I do believe that God was testing Abraham from the beginning till this time, just to see, make sure that he was ready to do God's will.
Completely agree.
Because he would be tested and he would fail, he'd be tested, he would fail. This time he did not fail. He was going to offer his son.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. And that applies to us as well. Everything we do in this life is a test. But a test is also an opportunity at the end of the day. We get opportunities from God all the time to do the right thing and to submit to him.
And we are tested daily the same way, to make sure we're ready when our time comes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other thoughts, comments?
If you go to Hebrews, particularly Hebrews 9 through 10, it talks about the tabernacle being a type of the church to come. So you have types and symbols in the Old Testament, type being the inferior and the New Testament being the superior, the antitype. So the tabernacle was a type, Christ's sacrifice was, Abraham's sacrifice compared to Christ was a type. So there's many, I think a lot of the Old Testament's given to us as kind of a physical, we can relate to the physical, a physical representation of all the spiritual that's going to come in the New Testament.
Absolutely. We have several images, temple imagery, spirit imagery. I can't get into them all off the top of my head right now, but there's several things we see in the Old Testament, these images that reoccur. And one of the best ones to follow is actually the temple. I encourage every one of you to start looking at temple imagery, starting all the way back in Genesis 1 and 2, actually, all the way up through the Old Testament and into the New Testament. There are several images like that where we can trace and follow these big ideas and see that the Bible is this huge united story that has all these same elements. Now, they don't always just jump off the page at us, and it takes time to figure it out sometimes. Because, we're studying documents that are thousands and thousands of years old, written in languages we don't speak. Most of us can't read. It's not easy all the time, but it's doable, and I think we all gain a great bit and a great service to our faith when we do that. So I definitely encourage that. Any other ideas, thoughts? Well, let's see. That was my last PowerPoint slide point, but I have one other, and I wasn't sure I was going to get here, so I left it out, but since we have the time, I will discuss it. There's one other big point I want to put in here, and it relates to this Genesis 22 idea. So at the end of this narrative, we get this ram caught in a thicket, and it's sacrificed instead of Isaac. That is a representation of Jesus. Jesus is called the Lamb of God. And we get this ram that is sacrificed in Isaac's stead, just as Christ is sacrificed in our stead. And there's comfort in that. Comfort in the death of a sacrificial lamb, or ram in the case of Genesis 22. But there's comfort to be found in the cross, in this, honestly, in this death. It's on the surface a bleak idea, comfort found in death of another. But it's what the entire biblical story calls for. We are spared because of Christ's death. And Romans 8:31, I think Paul puts this pretty well. And he actually pulls on a lot of Genesis type imagery. For I am sure that neither life nor death, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. The separation happens with sin in Genesis 3. And we struggle to overcome it throughout. We still do. We still struggle to overcome the separation from God. But why death? Why does Christ have to die? Why did the ram have to die in Genesis 22? It's because it's the one thing God's trying to overcome throughout the entire Bible is the sin's ultimate consequence is death. It's a reality, and it's something God's fighting just as much as us, because God does not give us death. God gave us life. God is quite literally the opposite of death in the Bible. God oftentimes is the one giving life to a hopeless situation. And I think that's what he does here. Abraham seems to be in a hopeless situation in a lot of ways in killing his son, but God gives him hope through a ram. We were in a hopeless situation because we were stuck in the wages of sin and death. And he gives us life through Christ. And God can't pretend death isn't here. We took his good creation and put death in it. So it's something he has to deal with the same as us. But he deals with it on our behalf because he has the power to do that. And that's comforting because it's not a battle we have to face. We have alone. We have to face it. We all have to face death. But God faces it on our behalf in a lot of ways because through him we have the cross. We have Christ. We have a sacrificial substitute for everything we've done. Because I'm not perfect. I've sinned, as is every other person in the world except for that sacrificial substitute for me and for you. Any thoughts or ideas on that? I guess as we are winding down here, is there any other ideas on Genesis 22 or further implications of it? I know this has been a little short, but I thought it was a meaningful discussion that I wanted to present. I think God himself always provides the sacrifice for us. He's provided it, all the way from here, Genesis 22, all the way up through Christ. Any ideas? I completely agree. Because sin's a personal thing in a lot of ways, because it's a separation from God, between you and God, between me and God, for my sin. And asking somebody else to take that on is a huge thing. And God does that and then some. He gives his child, his son, for us in the end. Anything else? Any other ideas, comments?
In verse 12, we're told to fear God, because he did what he said. He knows that that Abraham feared God. And that's something that, fear is not a bad thing when it comes to God. It is imperative that we fear God. He gives us life. He deserves our worship. He deserves our sacrifice, because sometimes we have to sacrifice things in order to worship. And we should always fear him.
The fear of God is something in the Bible I've always thought of as a healthy respect. A respect for him as for who he is as creator, as Lord, as our King, and ultimately as God. Not a God, the God of all creation. And I think that's definitely something to take with us, is that Abraham feared God in the end of this. He respected God for who he was and submitted to him. Anything else? Oh. I think this has been, raising your hand? Oh, sorry. I knew it was just a matter of time this morning before I did something like that. But thank you. This has been great. I've enjoyed it. I hope y'all have enjoyed it. I haven't quite hit my time limit, but I know I enjoyed this discussion. Honestly, wish I had thrown just a hair more in there, I guess. But I guess my final thoughts. Genesis 22 is a great story that pushes us towards Jesus. And just as you go throughout your week this week, if you're doing any personal study, I encourage you to find these moments of sacrificial substitutes throughout the Bible and in the same archetype as Genesis 22, because Christ is written all over it. Jesus is written. Anytime sacrifice is mentioned, there's an idea of Christ in there somewhere. I'm sure you can find it. And that's what I encourage y'all to do this week. I know it's what I'm going to strive to do. But yeah, Genesis 22 I think is a great passage for us. And I think it's ultimately a great passage to understand Jesus and what he eventually does or did for us. So if that's all I have this morning. Any other final closing thoughts? Well, if not, I guess we have a few minutes. So thank you.